Viral pneumonia has hit central China's Wuhan city. Authorities have reported 27 cases in total.
It's a new type of coronavirus.
A mystery virus they'd hoped to contain.
And then suddenly here it was in our own community.
Millions of people are securing themselves at home. Small businesses throughout the United States are scrambling to stay afloat.
Small businesses to the test. From nail salons to grocers to restaurants, they're all facing an existential.
It's Thursday, March 12th. The coronavirus has now entered a devastating new phase.
The U.S. death toll from the virus has surpassed 100 people.
20,000. More than 46,000.
150,000.
200,000.
400,000 people have now died from COVID-19.
500,071 dead.
Discretionary travel and avoid eating and drinking at bars, restaurants, and public food courts.
It says that central banks understand that slowing the spread of the coronavirus is crippling economically. When we are told to stay home, we don't spend. We're freezing our economy, we're freezing its ability to grow, but at the same time, we've got to pay our bills. A fiscal stimulus package. This is what Nancy Pelosi and Steve Mnuchin were working on Friday. It's what we're waiting for the Senate to pass. This is a big, giant package, and most likely we're going to get more than just this one that's going to inject money into the system to help people and businesses who are crippled right now.
Coronavirus, but it's also making it hard for so very many to survive financially.
People want to hear it's only going to be a matter of weeks and then everything's going to be fine.
COVID crisis has impacted so many industries this year as the virus forced businesses across the country to close their doors.
My name is Dan Wood, and I am a letterpress printer and artist. I've been running DWRI Letterpress as the owner and founder since, I think I changed the name of the business from a previous iteration in about 2002, so we're over 20 years old. I grew up in Boston, in the south end of Boston, an urban neighborhood filled with a lot of political activists, very unusual for the city of Boston, which is a very segregated city. It's a very economically and ethnically diverse neighborhood, and that had a deep impact on me in terms of my political work these days and just me as a person. I went to school in Boston. Eventually, when I went off to college, I studied originally history at McGill University. I went there for 2 years and then left to go to art school, and eventually studied printmaking at RISD, at Rhode Island School of Design. I was still in my senior year at RISD. I knew I'd be graduating college, as will you soon, and everyone else, eventually. But I knew I was going to need a job, so I had taken 2 classes. One was in welding and one was in offset printing, and I was really interested in doing larger runs of printmaking techniques. And immediately after graduating, I started working as an offset printer and as a digital typesetter at Johnson Wales University Print Shop. And then over the next 10 years, worked in a variety of different offset shops, generally most of the time as a press operator. And during that time, I was also doing a lot of work trying to teach myself how to do letterpress printing. So that's sort of the slow version or the quick version of how I got here. I would say there was a point as a teenager, young adult, I don't know how old I was, but I was in some store and, well, two things sort of came together as far as printing is concerned. One, I knew I wanted to be an artist at some point. So coming out of high school, I was very interested in making things. I didn't want to, at the time, I felt like if you're going to all the sort of expense and effort to go to college, I felt like I should be studying something other than art because I knew I wanted to make art, but to study, history, whatever it might be as a way of informing your artwork. So that was always there. I took a summer class at RISD while I was still at McGill that was called Light to Ink. And I was doing a lot of work with photography, and I also really liked printmaking. And so like etching and things like that. And so in this class, it was all about how to take photographs and turn them into, printmaking prints. Translate what used to just be a chemical-based photographic system, right, and turn that into an ink-based photographic system, which is strange because now that's how most photographers do their work. But at the time, it was just for commercial printing. That's how you did it. So I took this class. I was learning all about like CMYK, separations, and how to create halftone screens and stuff like that in a darkroom. And then at that time, I went to a discount food store in Newport, Rhode Island. It was called Tapa Paper Company. And there were cereal boxes that they were selling wholesale, like to school districts and stuff. But it would be like the Rice Krispies box, and instead of having 4 colors, it would only have the black and the cyan, right? Because why would they bother printing all 4 colors if they were just selling them at wholesale anyways? So I don't know if they were the setup boxes or what. But I remember seeing that and just being like, oh my God. Every photograph I've ever looked at in my life was a lie. It's just made up of different colored dots, right? And I would say clearly from that moment, it's pretty much a direct line to lots of the artwork and lots of the work I've been doing ever since, for sure. Pretty much right out of school, I started doing small projects on the side, right? So at that point, I wasn't calling myself DWRI, I was calling myself an even weirder name, which was Garbajawa, right? Which I won't even try to explain. But my first sort of 3 jobs as I'm working in commercial print shops on my own were I did a artist book for professor who teaches at URI, and so they had a small offset press there, so he would let me use the offset press as long as I would talk to students about it, and made an offset interior and then letterpress cover artist book for him. I did an offset newsletter or flyer for some friends who were starting an arts camp, and then I did a friend of mine's little sister's bat mitzvah invitation, right? And it's sort of strange because that's 1994, so that's 28 years ago. And this is all just on the side, but it's strange because literally from the beginning you're doing like invitations, custom art projects, and a little bit more commercial stationery, commercial printing. And what's strange is now 25 years later, here at DWRI, that really is kind of the weird mix of things we do because we're a commercial letterpress shop, so we're doing invitations, wedding invitations, announcements. But we're also doing, more commercial, business cards, foil sampling, die cutting, and then another third of the business happens to be, working with artists, making our own artwork, whatever the projects might be. And so it's sort of, it's interesting that sort of by coincidence that what I just happened to start at doing in the beginning has really carried through. Because for a lot of letterpress businesses, all of their work might be invitations. That's all they do. Or all their work might be fine art edition. But there's not a lot of shops that do commercial work plus all of those simultaneously. I did take a small business class at CCRI recently called 10,000 Small Businesses, and I learned about something called the sales funnel, right? So I've been in business for 25 years or whatever, and never understood any of these concepts. You know, where does your revenue come from? So that was very helpful. But in terms of the type of customers we have, I would say it really does sort of divide up into these sort of three main categories. So one is going to be invitations and announcements, right? People are willing to pay for the sort of fine work and the time that it creates to print a finely printed letterpress invitation, right? So that's definitely that's a big part of our business, and that's the big part of the business that was just shut down when COVID came, which we can talk about later. The other side would be, you know, business cards, stationery, letterhead. Trying to think of even what's just like on the tables here right now. Packaging goods, you know, whatever sort of things that end up making sense for this process, right? Enclosures. We do a lot of work for bulk coffee companies. So you can do things in volume that are going to would be very expensive if you're only doing 100, but if you're doing 1,000 or 5,000, we actually can be very competitive with other commercial processes. And because we here do have a lot of commercial background, it's a little bit unusual in a letterpress shop to have those skills. We'll do posters, we'll do art projects, you know, really as a, you know, auditioning art for other artists. We'll do postcards for artists. It really is a pretty big mix of things that we're doing here. In terms of who the customers are, it could be, you know, individuals who are planning events, you know, couples, whatever, wedding planners. We do a lot of work with graphic designers who may be working with other commercial printers to do the offset printing. But then if they have something that is very particular that they want for one of their customers, then they'll come to us to do the letterpress printing. And then we'll work a lot with individuals. We do a lot of work with other small businesses in terms of, we just have a customer who's a jewelry designer for whom we just did these foil stamped enclosures for all of their earrings. And so that's sort of the sort of, I don't know if that is a clear picture, but that's kind of the broad mix of people that we work with. So. For us, when the pandemic hit, it was interesting. I mean, it was crazy, but it was interesting because I've been doing this kind of work, you know, I've been doing this work as my sole source of income for over 20 years, right? Letterpress printing, and I've been involved in this field and doing letterpress printing either on my own or for others since 1994. And it was truly educational because even though I've been in this field for so long, but because it was my own shop and my own sort of set of clients, I never realized, because I never really thought too deeply about it, how much, so much of the work that we did was about or involved events or people coming together. Like, you know, a lay person could think about printing and the printing business and invitations, be like, yeah, well, duh, that's what you do. But in my mind, it's just kind of like, you know, I don't know, blah, blah, blah. But then, so basically what happened with us was up until that spring, maybe about 2 or 3 years later, I had, as I said, been involved in this small business course at CCRI, at Community College of Rhode Island, through 10,000 small businesses. And so I had gotten much more organized in terms of business practices. Even though I've been doing this for so long, that successfully, I would say successfully not gone out of business for all of this time. We were in a pretty good spot in terms of like really getting a better understanding of where the work's coming from, of how we're doing, of raising our prices, of sort of figuring out how things work. And so sort of aside from the shop work, it was the sort of interactions with the university where you're really getting the signs of how quickly things are changing, because one day you hear stories or rumors that this other school has closed their doors and sent everyone home overnight. You're like, what? That's crazy. And then 2 days go by and you're like, why didn't we do this sooner? Because things were changing so quickly. And then here, I just finished this project, which you'll hear about later, of the Linotype Daily, where I had been printing a new letterpress printed Linotype, which is a hot metal typecasting machine, Linotype cast news item or art print, whatever, every day, every single day for a year. This is the most recent one to date your video from March 30th, 2023. I've been working on that, and on February 29th was the last day of daily publication. And of course, that's like, a week after, 2 weeks before, everything is just completely hitting the fan. And so for, the next year and a half later, people I would see on the street would be like, oh my God, that event at your shop was the last thing I did in a group of people for the last 2 years. Like, you don't realize it because you're just in the midst of it, which is kind of funny. But for us, it was interesting, I think, because of the work we had done on the business to kind of expand it from being more of a niche printing business to being a little bit, because we were a little bit more involved in the bigger economy, plus the pandemic was just such a big deal, the work really literally just kind of like stopped. We were in the midst of printing a big project for, it was a tech company, and I won't remember their name, but we would print custom blank books for them with all these different colored covers that they were a remote working, funny enough, they were a remote working company, and when they would have this get together once a year where they'd have a conference and they would have this sort of swag bag of letterpress printed goods that people could use for their works the next year. And we were on a deadline trying to finish that, and it was a very, very, very big project. We bought all the paper, everything is underway. And then suddenly, we're seeing the headlines, we're feeling it in terms of seeing other customers, what they're doing, and we're thinking to ourselves, like, if this gets canceled, we're going to be in big trouble. And so it was actually a big help, because that customer who we worked with for a while, had the confidence in their own business and in terms of where things were going to say, okay, we do not need these, clearly, right? But, because the conference had been canceled, everything else, but, you go ahead, finish what you're doing, because we're almost done, bill us, and then just hold on to it, and we'll use it in the fall or in the spring, because at that point no one knew when things were going to change. But that was sort of the big order that was literally on the table. And had the pandemic happened, had the pandemic touched us 2 weeks earlier, we would have been in a lot more trouble, because we wouldn't have already put that effort into it. On top of that, very quickly, invitations, announcements, even business cards, because people were not interacting with each other, so they don't need business cards. All of that just stopped. And the invitations in particular was interesting, because especially that time of year, it's a big, that definitely is a very big time for, exactly, summer, fall weddings. And so, the business, that just like everything, no one knew what they were planning, they were going to do, but any of the new orders stopped, and then the current orders just had to stop, or we had to change the dates, and then we would change the dates again. And then there was sort of the one thing that was interesting is we did a whole new series, right, of cards for current customers that were basically like wedding delay cards. Like let's say they'd already sent out their invitations, and then we'd send out another little card saying, basically, please disregard that earlier notice, or we're, save the date, we're still getting married, but we're going to put it off until blank, whatever it might be. And so that happened, but really pretty much because of all the work that we'd done with the business, there was a lot of stuff on the dock, and it just stopped. So at that point, it was myself and 3 basically full-time employees. Yeah. And, within, 2 weeks or a couple of weeks of March, by the end of March, lockdown orders had finally come into place, which was good. But so within 2 weeks, nobody is coming in, because I live just a few blocks away, and there would be no one else here. I was able to come in to do the small projects that needed to be done. But that was the change. And then at that point, you're at a point where you're like, okay, how on earth is any of this going to work? That's kind of where we were. I would say at this point, the graphic designers, the wedding customers, things like that, that business completely disappeared and has now come back. But had you asked me that question, what are we in 2023? If you had asked me that question 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago even, it would be like, well, it's sort of starting to, but everything was still so unclear that a lot of that just stopped. As far as other businesses, there were definitely, there was one or two local businesses that switched their production to something less expensive than letterpress for their note cards, just because everything was so, they survived, right? But they no longer could pay us to do the work they were doing, and they switched it to cheaper printing methods.
So they really got back financially.
Exactly. Right, and that would have been, a job. That was one customer that was easily $20,000 to $30,000 a year, which for us would be, 10%, 8 to 10% maybe of our revenue, and so that was a big deal. And then in terms of, we did do a lot of work with restaurants and menus and sort of announcements and things like that. And then I did also have a lot of, when I would work with restaurants, I would often get paid somewhat in cash, but then there was another fellow business, you're trying to work things out. So I'd also have all these gift certificates, right, for barter. And so many of the restaurants that I ended up having gift certificates for went out of business, because if you're running a business during the pandemic, but we had good relations, we worked things out. But yeah, the restaurants and the invitation work, that stuff just really stopped. And then where I was lucky is working with, that one sort of tech customer. We at least finished that job, which would have been a nightmare to have to stop. But then I was very lucky. I'm trying to think in terms of the other customers, but in that first, say, like 2 to 3, let's say 3 to 4 months, where everything was very vague, there was a poet, Tina Kane, who was the state poet laureate at the time, whom we'd done a collaborative book with her and another artist named Esther Salones. And so we had been talking prior to the pandemic. When the pandemic hit, she wrote me and said, hey, I am going to need another run, like a second edition of these books. Is that something that would help you to do during the pandemic? If you don't have any work. And I'm like, oh my God, that would be such a help, right? Let's do it. And then the same with, I have a customer that has, we do wallpaper for, and editioned like fine print wallpaper. And they also reached out and said, hey, if, here's this other project we've been talking about over the years. And he's like, I'm ready to do it if this would help you keep things going. And so what's interesting is, because we did commercial work, artwork, invitation work, for that first couple, like really 6 months of the pandemic, it was the artwork customers, which you would think of as the not as lucrative or the non-commercial processes, that really saved us. Exactly. And it's also having relationships with people in so many different places that they needed the thing, and they're like, hey, I was going to do this. I don't know if I was going to do it now or in a year, but let's just do it now. And it keeps my printer alive, right? So, to this day, just as a quick side note, as far as like purely just ordering paper and things like that, right? The supply chain interruptions, like, truly were no joke, and it's still going on. So that at first it took a little while to hit us, because there's still a lot of warehouses with paper, right? But to this day, you would meet with a customer, you would plan a job, and you'd plan a job in this paper that is always available, or as of 10 o'clock a.m. on a Thursday, right? Plenty of paper at the mill, no problem. You get the okay from the customer, you place the order on Friday, and they're like, it's all out, we won't have it for 6 months, right? And so, like, literally, the amount of time that we spend, particularly Tom Sprankle, orders most of the paper in the shop, spends on the phone or on the computer trying to order supplies and order paper, is unbelievable. So, like, now if you're sitting down and you're working on a project with business cards, or let's say an art print, and you're spending all this time selecting the paper, that customer needs to be picking literally 2 or 3 papers, because no matter what the mills say, when you place the order, that might just not be there. So that's one huge, huge difference. As far as how things changed here, well, first of all, we were very lucky to be able to participate in the PPP program, right? As badly run and rolled out as it was at first, it was a huge help. And there were a lot of state programs, there were other federal programs that helped us out as well. But the thing that was one of the things that was so frustrating about it is there was the PPP, right? That was called Payroll Protection Plan or PP, yeah, Payroll Protection Plan. Exactly. And so what that would mean is your employees could, they would give you the money to keep your employees on the payroll, right? Trying to save these businesses, but they were also telling you that you can't actually pay the person to work even if they needed to work, because then they wouldn't be qualifying for the other benefits which were equally important for survival. And so it was a really tricky time. So we were lucky once we got more deeply into it, because that really did subsidize the business going forward. But it was a really sort of very clunky system that they rolled out, which meant that, basically you would get paid more. Your business would be doing often better, and your employees would be better if no one was doing anything, right? But that wasn't the purpose of the program. So it was a really annoying kind of hurdle to get through. But that did mean that I was able to retain all of my employees throughout the process, and then slowly people would start to come back, 1 day a week, 2 days a week, whatever you're allowed to do and whatever the work demanded.
So you were still able to keep, your employees here at DWRI?
Well, I was able to keep the employees at DWRI even if they were at home. So people weren't working, but they were able to stay as employees.
Supported by the DWRI.
Correct, exactly. And then slowly we get back to it. And then once we actually started to bring in 2 days a week, 1 day a week, 3 days a week, whatever it would be, and then some employees whose jobs didn't require them to be like on press, right? They could work at home. But then when we were here, of course, we all had masks, we had different areas. We worked with Polaris, which is through the state, which is like a business efficiency type state program. And so there would be different like red zones were zones where you had to wear a mask, and then yellow zones where you could not wear a mask, but you had to tell everyone. So anyways, it was an adjustment. So as we were saying before, just before the pandemic, I'd been involved in this typecasting printing project, right, called the Linotype Daily. And we were using a Linotype, which is this insane machine where as you type, right, whatever it is you're typing, it's dropping these little molds, putting them in place, and then as you're typing, it's casting in molten lead. There's a crucible of molten lead in the back. It's casting lines of little slugs, lines of lead type. So as you type, it's casting what you're typing in metal. Right? You take those metal slugs, put them in the press, and be printing instantly. So it's the machine that replaced handset typesetting in the 1880s, 1890s. Our machine's from the 1950s. Sort of the standard for newspaper production for most of the 20th century, for book production and newspaper production until the late 1970s. And so I did this project where I wanted to use this machine, which sort of, at the year 1900 kind of ushered us into this sort of new information world, where printing had gotten as fast as it could in terms of presses and things like that. And the one sort of bottleneck was handset typesetting, because everything was being set letter by letter by letter by letter, right? So the Linotype comes around, suddenly newspapers could have 40 pages, a city could have 10 newspapers instead of 5 newspapers, because before that you had to handset every single story, every single headline, print it, and then put all that type away and then reset the next paper, whereas the next day's paper. Whereas with the Linotype you could be typing to cast the story, printing the story, already setting the next story, and then remelting all of that metal for the next day's paper. So it's like truly a second printing revolution. So I wanted to use this machine, which in 1900 was so fast, right? But in the year 2019 was so painfully slow. It would take me 4 hours to print, maybe 6 hours to design and cast a print like this. This print is called Things Are Getting Weird. And so basically, what I had been doing was doing a new print every single day. And then I did that for a year. It ended February 29th. I thought it would be funny to do it on a leap year, even though right when I started, I was like, I can't believe I'm going to have to do this for one more day. Why did I do it during a leap year, right? But what I ended up doing is in that first month, I think I sort of got an addictive habit. I was already always following the news and interested in the news, but I sort of got into this habit where it didn't seem like the project could just stop. So in the last few weeks of the project, the early days of COVID are starting to hit the news at least. So this is before everything is shut down, because it's January, February. So I think, there was one headline or one card I printed that was, I'll probably get the phrasing wrong, but it was something like, reality TV, or fake businessman from reality TV show and vice president who led Indiana during most recent AIDS outbreak to lead US COVID response. This might be bad, right? And so those are sort of like the little inklings that there was something happening in the background, but none of us knew just how serious it was. There was another one, I can't even remember, but there was sort of like, you're reading it, and it's sort of at that time where we just really, truly did not know what any of us were in for. So like even at the end of December, there are already, like I don't remember when the cruise ships were not being allowed to come into Hong Kong or whatever it was, right? And then when the first cases were in Seattle. But it was such a strange time because literally all these different areas of the world and all these different countries were on these different time frames, right? So like even on the East Coast versus the West Coast, or in Canada versus the United States, right? So, and then in Italy was when things started to get really bad. They were 3 weeks, whatever was happening in Italy is where we would be in 3 weeks because of the speed at which the infections would spread. So you'd be reading this news, you'd be like, well, man, that sounds awful, blah, blah, blah. But then you're reading like the denial, and then they're trying to catch up with their actions, and then they're not reacting fast enough. And then the same thing is happening in cities all over the world, but it's still happening, with the exception of New Zealand, but it's still happening on their own scale, time frames. So it's pretty interesting. So I would say like there are definitely references in the stories about, little bits of the headlines, like about something happening on the West Coast or something happening in China or some story. The media consumer, right? I am a person who's producing and reading the news in the United States. And so you're getting even if I have these information sources from different places, you're still, this is what it felt like here on the ground, kind of, if that makes sense. So, but really quickly, so when this project ended doing daily, then I was keep doing once a week, once every couple of weeks as the news demanded. And one of the first, like the one I showed you a minute ago, the first one was called Things Are Getting Weird. That was the headline. And the subtitle was COVID-19 Turns World Upside Down. And it goes on and on and on. But one of the things, at that point, there were a lot of different formats I chose for the project. But a lot of the projects, it was still sort of imitating newspaper. There's some more art and creative typographical approaches, but it was still sort of referencing at least old newspaper headline styles and things like that. By the time it came to Trump kills nurses, it was such a different part where things were changing so quickly and things were they were scary, but also so frustrating that the one before that had the same exact structure. So it's 3 big, very, very bold 96-point Gothic medium condensed Ludlow headline for the graphic designers out there. And it said, don't drink bleach, right? Because you're listening to all this news and you're trying to process it, and you're like, oh my God, the President of the United States, as much as it pains me to refer to this person with that title, right? The President of the United States at the time was, going off on tangents, suggesting people inject themselves with bleach, right? And people are dying and getting sick because they'll do whatever the moron says. So, but anyway, so the largest one, what I found was, as the sort of format of these things changing, right, the headlines started to change because it started to be less about, we didn't have time to process the full story, even though I still would do prints like that, but it was more just like, wear a mask. That's it. Stay home would be another print, right? The don't drink bleach was another one where it was just like, I think I can't even remember what the subheadline was, but in terms of the one you were mentioning, Trump kills nurses, right? This was all of the sort of selfish actions by a lot of people, but particularly by the government. They were withholding medical supplies from one city to the next, looking for political favors. The various governors were all in competition with each other to try to get whatever you call the safety equipment, the masks, the gloves. Was it PPDs, personal protection device, maybe? And so it was such a crazy time period. And so looking at that, it's like, okay, obviously one person's not responsible for the pandemic, but it's like this person's actions, the President of the United States, who is literally blackmailing the governor of New York or the governors of wherever and saying, I'm not going to let these truckloads of safety equipment for your nurses and doctors get to you unless you do these political favors for me, is just so crazy. So it was like, okay, what does this actually come down to? It comes to the President of the United States' actions killing our healthcare professionals, right? Telling people not to wear masks is getting people killed. And so that's where that headline came from, Trump kills nurses. Don't drink bleach. At that point, it was 43,000 Americans were dead, right? And then, at some point it was 100,000, right? And then that's, what is that? May 27th, 2020. And then by July 1st, right, it's 154,000 people are dead. And then, in each one of these things, you're still, it's not the high point, but you're still sort of you're still shocked at that number. But then, more time goes by, and suddenly we're at 500,000 people dead. Now it's over a million. But so, what's interesting about the project was making these prints. It was a way for me to kind of confront and express the sort of frustration that I think so many people were feeling, because, I'm lucky to have both access to the equipment as well as the motivation, but I'm lucky to have this outlet and the ability to kind of convey these things in a typographic form which other people can relate to have that skill, to allow me to sort of put some of this out there into the world, and then have that communication with the people who are seeing these. 5,000 people might be seeing it on Instagram, but only 25 people or 100 people are going to see the actual paper copy, right? But it's still sort of, because it's handmade, they see it on the computer or on their phones, and they're paying more attention to it, because somehow that, as an artist, as a craftsperson, that sort of energy that you're doing by creating something, even though it's just a digital image, right? There's something about that process that the person who's looking at appreciates, or it's somehow that energy seeps through even a computer, which is kind of interesting. That's one of the things that's been most interesting for me about the project, is the way it's being experienced in different places. I would say, first of all, well, thank you for coming and for asking these questions and setting this up, and also doing these kinds of recordings, I think, is so important for the public record to have, your artistic interpretation of a couple different people in Providence's and Rhode Island's experiences. I think it's just valuable as it's on its own. I definitely, I never want to say things are going well, because it's like when you're running a printing press, someone's like, you're never going to say to the person next to you, this job is running great, because then immediately the press is going to start jamming paper and ink's going to be in the wrong place, and it's a nightmare, so I don't want to jinx anything. But I would definitely say that 2022, beginning of 2023, but 2022 in particular was definitely the first, purely by the numbers, not, the paper shortages, the things still being a little bit wacky scenario, but purely by the numbers was the first year where you're kind of like, okay, we're kind of back on track to where we were. Even if, I would say we're somewhat back on track to where we were, even if the way, the kinds of jobs that we're doing may have changed a bit. So maybe there's definitely less restaurants. A lot of restaurants changed their whole approach to paper goods, online menus, because everything went online for the ordering anyways. So that changed, but so I'd say, simply put, in terms of where we are, purely from a number standpoint, right, you're feeling better. However, one thing about running a small business is you have no security whatsoever in your mind, and you have to just live with that. Right? And so, this started before the pandemic, where things had sped up. So you'll have work for next week, but maybe you can have too much work for next week, but then you have no idea what you're doing in 3 weeks. Like there's the cycle at which work comes in is so much shorter that, and you can't walk around with that tension all the time, so you just have to kind of accept, like, yeah, the phone will ring, and if it doesn't ring, we'll figure something else out, right? And so that's one thing. The other way I think it has affected a lot of people is that there is a sort of reminder that if you're going to be working so hard, right, and if you're going to be putting in all of this effort and labor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that you do, if you have the ability, kind of want to shape it into doing something that has meaning for you, right? And that you enjoy, et cetera. And so that, like, the focus of the shop, I would say, I have found a way with the Linotype Daily Project and other ways to sort of slowly shift some sort of art creative making more into the business practices. So that would be one way that things have shifted, that it's like, hey, actually, this is contributing income and you like doing it more. And so that working with artists, making our own artwork becomes a little bit more central to some of the economic foundation of the business, because the thing that people said would be unreliable, making a living in the art world, or not the art world, but making a living doing the art creating or printing that you love, ended up being a little bit more stable for me in this world, in this time. So that's sort of an important lesson, I think, too. The pandemic had a huge impact on me and my business, clearly, right? But I feel extremely lucky to be here sitting talking to you today, right? And having avoided some of the most dire consequences. And I feel like to my experiences here, through this period may have been, difficult. I think for young people, having a daughter who was in high school at the time, locked up into a small apartment with her weird dad, right? All that kind of stuff is difficult, but still is pales in comparison to all of the suffering that has been experienced around the world and in this country and in this neighborhood. And so I feel just like very, very grateful to have been able to keep this thing going. But I feel like we are a minor blip in terms of some of the major effects, to have not lost people, immediately close to me, in terms of incomes being changed but not lost, all of these things. Exactly. I just feel so grateful, not just grateful, but I feel like I think it's just so important to be sort of great, it's so important to be aware, to appreciate the fact that throughout the pandemic I had a roof over my head and a refrigerator with food in it, right? Which is not the case for many, many people, not empty chairs at the table for family members you lost. Was not my experience, and I feel very, very grateful for that. So.